If anyone feels uncomfortable about being recorded, please keep your cameras off. We also ask you to please mute yourself. My name is Samhar Johannes, and I, along with my colleagues, Emily Cohen, Susan Graham, and Jasmine Shoemaker, we run the Spotlight Guest Instructor Workshop series. In this series, we invite university community members and friends to share their research and creative endeavors in a 1-hour talk hosted in the library or virtually. Due to the ongoing success of the Spotlight series, we have expanded the parameters to create a semester-long themed symposium. This fall, the semester-long symposium, titled Prison State, aims to explore the regional and pervasive impact of prison incarceration in Maryland and the current debate around prison abolition. The inspiration for this theme comes from the library's special collections prison-related materials, as well as the gallery's exhibit currently being hosted titled Prison Nation. Today, we invite our third speaker for the symposium, Kevin Muhitch. Kevin received his MA in history from UMBC in 2020, where his research examined mass incarceration in Maryland by tracing debates over prison sitting in the late 20th century. He formerly served as a research fellow at the Sentencing Project, where he focused on voting rights, extreme sentencing, and racial disparities in the US criminal legal system. He also worked as a research assistant on Dr. Mosgroff's historical mapping project, Black Power in Washington, D.C. Currently, he serves as a research associate in Washington, D.C., where he primarily conducts historical research for litigation involving Superfund sites. His presentation today is titled No Prospect for Relief: Community Activism and the Politics of Prison Sittings in Maryland in 1970 to 1987. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin.
Thanks everyone for coming today. Let me see if I can get my screen shared really quick and then we can get going with this. Can everybody see this slideshow?
Yes.
Yes. All right, so I just want to start off by thanking the organizers of the Prison Nation exhibit, the library, of course, the Drescher Center and UMBC, all for having me speak today. I also wanted to give a quick shout out to the UMBC History Department for providing me with funding to support me while I was researching this topic during graduate school. It's no understatement to say that this project and probably my whole career wouldn't have happened without that support, so I'm eternally grateful. It's a real honor to be able to be here at UMBC. I did a lot of my research in special collections here, so you'll see some of that today. And this presentation is drawn from that master's thesis, as well as some continuing drafts that are under review right now. Okay, so when I began my studies, my graduate studies at UMBC, I was sort of obsessed or deeply interested with the historical context of mass incarceration, both at the state and local level. And in particular, I was extremely interested in why Maryland ended up with prisons in so many rural places. So, you know, if you've driven around Maryland, you know that Western Maryland and Allegheny County, there's huge prison complexes, as well as Somerset County. But I found this map early on in the archives. This is from 1975. And the triangles on the map are large prison complexes. The stars are kind of these like really tiny places that are like pre-release centers that just have like a couple hundred people here and there. And I started to really think about this phenomenon historically, right? So in 1982, only about 2% of people in Maryland's prisons were confined in either the far western part of the state or on the Eastern Shore. And you know, on that past map, also Garrett and Allegheny County are just completely cut off. It's another interesting thing. By 2021, 36% of Maryland's prison population is confined in those two places. And so, you know, a number of scholars in the social sciences had started to talk about this phenomenon as the rural prison boom of the 1980s and 1990s. Yet, I think, you know, we focus on these two questions here. So mass incarceration is a process of state capacity building. So why did the state choose to build capacity in some places but not others? But I also quickly realized that officials actually sought to initially concentrate prison building in Baltimore City. And so I wondered why or how the effects, how urban residents affected that trajectory, right? Because as social scientists have pointed out, many of these decisions were made on the backbones of crises. So you talk about political economic restructuring, deindustrialization, changes in land use, the urban uprisings of the 1960s and 1970s. And these things weren't, why did this end up fomenting in rural places but not urban ones, right? And so I thought through a focus on social and political history, I could make visible the ways that urban protests restructured these paradigms. And in fact, I found pretty quickly that in the 1970s, officials and policymakers had attempted on 3 separate sites to bring large prisons into the city. And in all 3 times, their efforts were rebuked by activists. So this talk will just examine those struggles and then what that forced policymakers and officials to do, including briefly a period where they considered decarceration, which I think is something that's not in the current literature, before they ultimately moved to rural places where they marketed prisons as some form of economic development. And just before I get into that story, it's a little bit of background about prison growth in the 1970s for people who are unaware. Oftentimes we see this as a 1980s and 1990s phenomenon, but mass incarceration was well underway by the 1970s. So Maryland's prison population increases about 37% within 7 years from 1970 to 1977. And that increase is driven largely by sentencing lengths. More people are being arrested too, but on average, people are held for about 55% longer, even when we exclude life sentences. And so without any kind of decarceral policy, the state chooses to build new prisons to deal with this problem. And you can see this here in this graph. I know just looking at numbers isn't always the most compelling, but if we look at the map or the chart figure 2, we can see from 1970 to 1980, it's almost a straight shot up before briefly coming down. And then the right is sentencing length or average stay, and that's also just a straight shot up. Okay. So in spring 1976, the Mandel administration begins its first efforts to bring new prisons to Baltimore as it made plans to dock the state's first floating prison. That April, representatives from a number of state agencies traveled to Newport News, Virginia, hoping to expand the state's prison capacity at little to no cost. They toured 2 ships docked at the James River Naval Reserve, and, quote, after examining the feasibility of obtaining and converting former U.S. naval transport ship for correctional use, the group settled on the USS William O. Darby as their preferred prison ship. And that move was the first of the state's 3 failed efforts. And while this could have happened, or these ships rather could have been docked in any of Maryland's numerous waterways, the Mandel administration over and over again targeted the city of Baltimore using arguments of what I call carceral weight. And so that's the idea that jurisdictions with the most incarcerated people should necessarily serve as the sites of new penal institutions. So concentrating the effects of mass incarceration geographically, right? And during the 1970s, that view was shared by a number of people for a variety of reasons. The secretary of Mandel's Department of Public Safety, a guy by the name of Robert J. Lally, had echoed Mandel's colorblind racial resentment by the mid-1970s, writing that overcrowding in prisons was a, quote, problem not created by the state, and thus implying that it was only created by the city alone. Others, such as one editorialist in the Baltimore Sun, argued that the city should host penal institutions because, quote, penal authorities believe rehabilitation is best attempted when such programs can be carried out in familiar surroundings. So obviously that's also a little bit of a strange thing to say, but we can get to that more in Q&A. But the sighting of the prison ship created a second crisis for the state as urban residents began organizing to stall the plan. The Southeast Community Organization, or SECO as I'll call them through the rest of the talk, quickly began a vigorous campaign against the prison ship soon after its announcement. And by that time, SECO had established itself as a central community organization in Baltimore's predominantly white working class Southeast side. By the time the ship was supposed to be docked, they acted as an umbrella organization working on a variety of issues, including highways, They're among the groups in the late 1960s that stopped the highway that would have gone through Southeast Baltimore, for instance. Also work on public housing, libraries, and education. So they already had this existing grassroots team that kept the issue in public view by alerting local media outlets of developments, staged protests, and distribute over 200 t-shirts and 1,200 posters with the text "No Prison Ship" on them. And if anybody finds one of these, let me know. I'll pay top dollar for them. And so literature distributed by the group also alleged that the ship would harm redevelopment efforts and lead to pollution in the harbor. According to this fact sheet as well, they believe they had evidence that the ship itself wouldn't have had or would have had inadequate sewage facilities, meaning that sewage from this prison ship would have been dumped straight into the harbor, if you can even imagine that. But this project proved short-lived. Among SECO's efforts, Mandel's administration struggled to find a legal avenue to transfer the ship from the U.S. Navy to the state of Maryland. In June 1976, officials told one corrections publication that the project was, quote, in danger of being scuttled by bureaucratic red tape, and that the state was scrambling to find a way through the maze of federal requirements to get the ship transferred. Ultimately, in November 1976, so just after 5 months, the Maritime Administration's lawyer declared the ship transfer was illegal under federal law, ending SECO's battle against the prison ship. But the state didn't stop there trying to concentrate prisons in Baltimore City. So by the time the prison ship plan sank, the state mobilized a second effort to build a new prison within city limits. And hoping to take advantage of vacant factory space in the rapidly deindustrializing city, Governor Mandel set his sights on a recently shuttered Continental Can factory at 3500 East Biddle Street. So just as earlier transformations in urban infrastructure had relied on the inclusion of private investors and profiteers, real estate developers, etc., so too did prisons. So on August 3rd, 1976, this man on the left, Morton Sarubin, and his development company, Second Biddle Associates, purchased this empty factory for just under $2 million. Sarubin is characterized in the Baltimore Sun as a politically connected developer who, quote, specialized in government subsidized renovations. And there's no doubt that he realized the money to be made investing in the potential for prison growth. And I think this plan really shows us the sort of banal opacity of public-private arrangements that in this case function on the boundaries of legalized corruption. As the prison deal advanced into the guise of ending overcrowding, it even became clear to commentators that the governor's insistence on the site was partially due to Sarubin's political influence. When a proposal was taken up at a Board of Public Works meeting for the sale of the site in November 1976, for instance, just a few months after the site was purchased, Baltimore community newspaper that's unfortunately no longer in existence, called City Dweller, noted that the item, quote, did not appear on the agenda and was not accompanied by the backup material that usually accompanies major state purchases. So this really scared, activists, residents, and even some journalists alike. Sarubin also had a lot of personal connections that made people worried. So his cousin was a man by the name of Irv Covens, who was actually Marvin Mandel's leading fundraiser. And Sarubin had also been temporarily banned from receiving HUD funds after an investigation into corruption at a subsidized housing project he owned on the west side of the city. And this is all even more ironic because according to many reports, the project wouldn't have even done anything to curb overcrowding in state facilities. Even Alan Wilner, Mandel's chief legislative aide, told the City Dweller that the planned prison would lack the capacity to begin to reverse the problem. So again, we see that it's sort of a solution, but who knows? So, but the decision to relocate efforts to Baltimore's east side was likely one that the state officials believed could stifle growing resistance to prison projects. The Continental Can site was located on the border of the Kenwood and Orangeville neighborhoods, which were largely segregated by race. Yet almost immediately, organizations from both the Black Kenwood and predominantly white Orangeville neighborhoods began meeting together and formed the Concerned Citizens of East Baltimore, or the Concerned Citizens as I'll call them from here on out. They incorporated leadership from both neighborhoods and elevated the work of Black women in Kenwood in particular, especially Zatella Giles, who is pictured here, wearing the big no prison sign. And local officials also became interested in this fight quickly. At this very protest, Baltimore City Council person that many of you probably know, Mary Pat Clark, told the Baltimore Sun, it quote, stinks all over East Baltimore, speaking of the project. And here I also want to point out that the concerned citizens' position illustrates many of the anxieties that urban residents felt after seeing the economic divestment that surrounded existing prison sites. Joyce Clasing, for instance, of the Orangeville neighborhood, would tell the Baltimore Sun, we see what's left around the Maryland Penitentiary downtown, stagnation and no homes. In another newsletter published by the group, they argued that the site would lead to the destruction of, quote, stable Black neighborhoods. And I think we have to think about this historically. I think we see this kind of thing portrayed as NIMBY a lot in the literature. But I think these concerns were also compounded very significantly by the economic dislocation of factory closures. Many of these people worked at the factory and didn't see a future for themselves if this was the change in infrastructure around them, right? We also know that Black families around the factory often were forced to pay double that of their white neighbors for modest row homes. So obviously, the kind of racialization of space, the racialization of economy also plays into how these anxieties are felt amongst people. And back to this argument of carceral weight that I referenced earlier. So this is a letter from Governor Mandel to Zatella Giles after she writes complaining about the site to the governor. In the second paragraph down, I know it's hard to read the source probably, but just so you know, it actually exists. I put it here. But he tells Zatella Giles, since the overwhelming majority of inmates in the correctional system are from Baltimore City, it is clear that the next major correctional institution should be located within the city, right? So he's kind of assuaging her concerns, trying to convince someone who doesn't want this next to their house that they should, because they're trying to criminalize the space of Baltimore, right? I think it's an important point. Yet the politics of activists in East Baltimore proved durable as the coalition expanded to include community organizations and support from more elected officials. By December of the same year, SECO, one of their rallies is right here, agreed to ally with the concerned citizens in the prison struggle, recognizing the need for broader alliances to stall current and future prison projects. 3 months later, a SECO publication had claimed that the coalition represented, quote, over 35 groups and 40,000 individuals. And Baltimore's Black elected officials also made prison construction a key debate at the state level. Clarence Mitchell, who some of you might know if you're historians of Baltimore as well, was an early supporter of these efforts, as well as Robert Douglas, who in April 1977 went on to lead a filibuster against appropriations for these plans in the State House. And he commented to the Baltimore Afro-American that the issue was bigger than East Baltimore, and right now it looks like the whole city will come behind it. And so here's another photo from a protest, just to get a little bit more context. But something else happens in 1977. And that's that Marvin Mandel is found guilty of corruption on August 24th, and he's forced to resign, appointing Blair Lee as his successor before he leaves office. And while that event became the defining political spectacle of state politics that summer, Lee is still caught in the prison dilemma, the new governor, right? So in October 1977, he plans to still go ahead with the Continental Can site, which is purchased by the city, or not the city, the state, for $2.9 million. But the value of that property had dropped even in the eyes of the state. So the Baltimore Sun notes in its coverage that the value had dropped due to some General Assembly members finding the deal, quote, shady. Here's some more protest flyers from that era. So by the end of 1977, SECO organized a call-in campaign targeting state senators and delegates, urging them to vote against the prison plan, highlighting the support of nearly 8,000 local residents who had voiced their support through alternatives such as senior housing. The coalition then mobilized direct protests with a rally in January 1978, which was immediately deemed a success by leadership, who claimed that nearly 1,000 people had been in attendance. And with community support, SECO and the concerned citizens came together to draft this architectural plan. And this is from Special Collections, so thank you to everyone there. They consulted with an architectural firm to draw up plans to show the state something else that could be done with the site, right? The authors of the plan highlighted a local problem that the prison proposals had ignored. the growing need for low-cost senior housing in the neighborhood. The authors right here, it's hard to see, but I'll read it. They wrote, over 2,700 elderly persons are living in poverty, and over 3,000 elderly persons are currently on the waiting list for citywide senior housing. So again, I think we need to think about how people articulate the needs of their neighborhoods differently than a state official would, and what it means for them to go through the effort to have a plan like this drafted and ignored, right? But it does have some effect on state officials. So 1 month after the senior housing protests and after this is drafted, the Baltimore Sun announced that the state officials were now considering a new site at Fort Armistead in South Baltimore, which is a former defense fort on the southern edge of the city that was then being used as a park and still is. And Fort Armistead offered what officials believed was an opportunity to move along the path of least resistance. The governor's office even acted to appease the potential neighbors, offering a sewage system, recreation, and road enhancements in exchange for endorsement of the site by a local community organization. But these efforts did little to avoid backlash, as reports soon surfaced that pollution from a nearby pigment plant made the land and air at the Fort Armistead site potentially toxic. And anyone who studies South Baltimore or has spent a lot of time there, done organizing there, knows that pollution is a major problem and has been for a long time. Another thing we can get into in Q&A. And the state's concession also did little to appease the surrounding community, even given what they were trying to give them, right? So according to longtime citizens of South Baltimore, many thought the plan was a, quote, gimmick, including a man named Hubert McCormick, who told the Baltimore News American, all the state is trying to do is get the people of East Baltimore off the politicians' backs. In 1978, when this is all still unfolding, is also a gubernatorial election year. And as that election approached, activists tried to engage more thoroughly in electoral politics to push back on prison-citing plans. Led by Zatella Giles, members of SECO and the Concerned Citizens organized a mass voter registration drive. And during that drive, they handed out these flyers, which are also in special collections, amazingly. They distributed these pamphlets claiming that a vote for Lee was a, quote, vote for the prison. The pamphlets took further aim at Lee's connection to Mandel, stating, Mandel and friends made $1 million on the sale of the Continental Can site to the state. Mandel and friends were guilty of political corruption. Blair Lee III was lieutenant governor under the Mandel administration. Now Blair Lee III, the acting governor, wants to put the prison at the Continental Can site. Right, so they're keeping this idea of corruption and an undemocratic governance, right, in the forefront. And it indeed did become a major election issue for the people of Baltimore. Ironically, even representatives of traditionally white, at the time, conservative South Baltimore were forced by the prison dilemma to argue that the state had been locking up too many people by the 1970s, as they feared protests would break out both over East Baltimore and the Fort Armistead site. Right? According to one report, two elected officials, Jerome Connell and Henry McGurk, whose districts were close to Fort Armistead, were found, quote, railing against the fact that Maryland has the third highest rate of incarceration in the nation, not something we associate with conservative politicians in the Get Tough era, right? So I want to say that whereas appearing tough on crime was one way to ensure votes in the 1970s, it wasn't always a way to ensure votes, right? So as the reality of rapidly expanding prison infrastructure took its hold, some conservatives found them even themselves to be unlikely advocates of at least a very limited version of decarceration, right? And this phenomenon extends beyond just the local officials. So both Hughes and Beale, Democratic and Republican candidates for governor respectively, stated during a debate that they would abandon the Fort Armistead plan. And then after Hughes becomes governor in 1979, he very quickly announces that there would be no new facility at either Continental Can or Fort Armistead. And this is a photo also from UMBC Special Collections. Thank you big time to Fenny Roca. I don't know if they're here, but they pulled all these for me. They found these in some random place. And so that's the reason I have these, which is amazing. So this is a celebration after doesn't go through. So, you know, just to summarize the Baltimore story quickly, in the late 1970s, residents fought off prison construction in the city at a moment when many state actors hoped to concentrate carceral infrastructure there. And even though the Continental Can site and to some extent Fort Armistead remained vacant for decades after the struggle, the state's failure to locate a new prison in Baltimore also signals that they have to pursue other strategies, right? So moving on. Okay. So as I've stated, the success of anti-prison campaigns in Baltimore was an inflection point for carceral politics in Maryland. Even national outlets like the Washington Post said that the only question, or during the 1970s, the only question was where the new prison should be built, not whether it should be built at all. So at the end of the decade, Maryland briefly pursued a decarceration strategy to deal with overcrowding before, I would argue, law enforcement officials sabotaged the plan. So as one of his first actions arriving in office, Governor Hughes assembled a task force to study the problem of prison overcrowding. And I was really surprised in the Maryland State Archives when I found this, because the task force is written by a number of prominent local and national reform advocates. Judge Robert B. Watts, who was an old civil rights head, was one of the authors, as well as William Nagel, who was an early abolitionist, Frank Dunbar, who's probably the most prominent prisoner rights lawyer in Maryland, as well as M.K. Harris, who's a Temple professor and also the founder of the popular Inside Out prison education programs. Some people may have even participated in here. So that was pretty cool. Nevertheless, the task force argued that given the enormity of racial disparities within state prisons and the criminal justice system's inability to control crime, even with the astronomical rates of incarceration, it couldn't recommend construction of a large prison similar to what had been proposed at the Continental Can factory. And Hughes really took this to heart. He publicly questioned the efficacy of prison building right after it was released, saying that, quote, just building prisons doesn't solve our crime problem. Part of that shift was also to hire this guy on the left, a guy named Gordon Comka, to be the head of the Department of Public Safety. And Comka was kind of known around the state for taking a rehabilitative approach to corrections. He's not an abolitionist by any means, right? But he did agree that one of the most important things was to expand services for incarcerated people, as well as expand opportunities for parole so people could get out earlier and quicker, right? And he was also against large-scale prison construction, which is not something we associate with departments of public safety. So as Comka explained when he was appointed, and he says, quote, the problem in Maryland is not that we don't have enough prison space, we have too many prisoners, which is kind of was striking for me when I found that, right? And so at least partially as a part of his policies, daily populations in Maryland's facilities dropped for the first time in a decade during 1979. But police and prosecutors largely disavowed this approach, namely Donald Pomerlew, who's on the right. Anyone who studies Baltimore history has probably gotten familiar with him. He was the leader of the Inspectional Services Division, which was a division that was later found to have illegally surveilled residents, activists, journalists, politicians, and attorneys. And that kind of foreshadowed the length to which he would go to discredit less punitive crime control approaches. Right. I think even Dr. Musgrove writes about him in his book about the repression of Black elected officials. So he's kind of nationally known for that. Okay, so Pomerlew really goes after Comka, especially in this one instance. So on March 27th, 1981, the Baltimore Police Department stages a raid on 2 vans returning 27 people to prison, incarcerated people to prison. They were out on work release that day. I'm going to school, going to jobs, pre-release, right? The Baltimore City Police stops the van, arrests everyone in them, and charges them with over 60 different offenses, the vast majority of which were minor infractions, things like escape for skipping work or school, and by far the majority of them are dropped very quickly. But leading up to the raid, the New York Times would later report police officers had helped television crews erect lights at the scene in advance of the raid so that cameras could record better pictures. And newspaper reporters were allowed to ride with the officers to make sure that they would not miss any of the action, end quote. And so we can see that that was an attempt by Pomerlew and the Baltimore Police Department to go after many of these more progressive policies, right? There's more to this there, but this is just one instance, right? And that move proved disastrous for Comca as well as other progressive officials with the state. So the Baltimore Sun would shortly opine after the incident, quote, "The first priority is to build adequate housing for all inmates. Only then can officials worry about experimental rehabilitation programs and alternatives to long stays in prison." Another person would tell the Sun, quote, "With all the Comca failures, the so-called progressive penal philosophy is dead in this state." And Comca famously resigns 4 days after the event. And so between 1980 and 1983, I don't have data from the very beginning of 1981 to 1983, but from 1980 to 1983, the state prisons population grows by close to 50%. So obviously this skyrockets again. And there's other factors, right? But this is one important one. So police organizing and worsening overcrowding force officials to find a different way to deal with this crisis, right? So with decarceration off the table, at least for now, Governor Hughes altered the state's course by announcing he would build a large new rural prison in rural Hagerstown in October of 1981, just a few months after this incident. Hagerstown had long been a prison town in Maryland, right? They had 2 existing prisons, one built in 1932 and one in 1966, but they weren't happy about accepting a third. They wrote, the Washington Post wrote that Hagerstown was, quote, "being held hostage by Hughes' plan." And that same year, the state actually legislates prison siting for the first time. So in the general construction bill that gives them money to start building this new prison, they write that that the state can't build new prisons in Baltimore or Hagerstown or Jessup, actually, when they write this in. And I want to stop here just for a second because it says Forest Street Complex is here. So I think this is an interesting point. That's where the Baltimore City prisons are concentrated, the jail and prisons. So while Jessup and Hagerstown get to be completely omitted from future projects, it's only this small sliver of Baltimore, which I haven't quite figured out what that means yet, but I think it's interesting. And so with the state showing no signs of amending things like arrests and sentencing policy, Hughes creates another task force because just this prison in Hagerstown isn't going to solve the prison overcrowding problem. And obviously these other places are off the table. So it's called the Task Force on New Prisons. And the group is tasked with finding a new place to put prisons. And they recommend very quickly the construction of a new 1,000 bed prison near Princess Anne in Somerset County on the state's rural eastern shore. Due to its, quote, "cheap land, its high unemployment, and distance from densely populated residential areas." And this is really the first major move away from that carceral wait paradigm I mentioned earlier. And some of this is because for the first time, people figure out how to convince local elites to support these things. And so local elites kind of welcome this announcement in Somerset County. On February 1st, 1983, for instance, this guy on the left, Tony Bruce, he's the head of Somerset County's Economic Development Commission, and he delivers testimony at a commissioners meeting arguing that the prison was the county's clearest path to economic prosperity. As he stated, the prison is also economic development. In fact, it is as clean an industry as we could find. There are no belching smokestacks, no toxic wastes, no noxious odors, there are just jobs. And so to power brokers such as Bruce, the project could mitigate unemployment and the environmental effects of industry and agriculture, regardless of the implications for incarcerated people and their families. And I haven't really been able to find the same level of resistance to these sites, which could be for a number of reasons. But for one, vocal opponents of the site were largely limited to members of the rural county's white professional class. They often espoused concerns over declining property values of being near a prison, but did not appear to build broad coalitions across race and class in the county, right? And leaders also tended to have very mixed motivations about prison construction here. So for instance, one man, he's a local realtor named J.L. Howard, had actually delivered a petition to the County Board of Commissioners opposing the site, but then later tells a newspaper that he felt obliged to participate in land sale negotiations for the prison site as the county's largest realtor. Right, so you get these conflicting messages, right? It's not It's not that he's completely against the prison if he can make some money off of it, which I think is very interesting. And so opposition to the prison is also likely curtailed because of Somerset's racist political structure. And I say racist, not racial, right? So due to the county's organization under at-large voting districts, it does not have a single minority-majority district in a county that's 40% Black. By July 1985, for instance, almost a third of Somerset's eligible voting age population was Black, and yet no Black candidate had ever won an elected seat in the county, the very body that appointed people like Bruce to the Economic Development Commission. And so I would say that while the efforts of middle-class Black activists and elected officials helped stymie things like the Continental Can Project, in a place like Somerset, the cards are more stacked against people, right? Because you're literally structurally held out of representation. And so this actually becomes a longer issue later on. And so this is from the Prison Policy Initiative in 2010. We find out later that in 1986, the same year that the prison is built, the county settles a Voting Rights Act lawsuit, which that lawsuit, the end of it, promised to ensure a fair shot for Black representation in the county, creating the first minority-majority district in the county's history. Yet, planners placed the Eastern Correctional Institution, this new prison, into that district so that a large percentage of African Americans in the district were incarcerated and thus couldn't vote. So it doesn't end up giving more representation, right? And just a little thing on this too. So Maryland actually bans this a few years after Prison Policy Initiative posts this. We're the first state to ban prison-based gerrymandering, which is awesome. That's one good thing that's happened, right? And so just to conclude, just to wrap this up. So by the 1980s, prison siting in Maryland was decisively rural, even after officials had hoped to concentrate prisons in cities, right? Projects such as Somerset County's Eastern Correctional Institution had been marketed as economic solutions to declining economic fortunes, rather than attempts to concentrate prisons under the formula of carceral weight. In 1996, just 10 years after that, the Eastern Correctional Institution was built. Sorry, I keep seeing comments come in. In 1996, just 10 years after the Eastern Correctional Institution was built, another one was built under similar rationale in Western Maryland, the Western Correctional Institution, where the state built a prison on the site of a shuttered factory. And so retracing this can show us how the rural prison boom is a result of both these political economic shifts that social scientists have shown, and also officials' response to local dissent in a number of contexts and how they navigate that, right? We also should see that prison siting decisions were influenced by and influence access to democratic institutions, right? So where civil society is stronger, where activism is stronger, these development decisions tend to be more ridiculed at least, or debated, even if they're not completely defeated, right? And on the flip side of that, something like a prison can gerrymander districts, right? So it can shape the way democratic participation works afterwards, which is another reason why this is a really important topic. And finally, the thing that I like to leave everyone on when I talk about mass incarceration is that mass incarceration is a process driven by human agency, and that prison expansion was a policy decision, right? There are moments in this history where you can see the state looking other ways, pursuing changes in sentencing policy, or decarceration, or expanding parole, et cetera. But this is a decision that people made to continue mass incarceration, right? And so with that, I think we can go to Q&A. Thank you so much. I hope I didn't talk for too long.
Oh, it's only 12:45, so I open it up to the audience. You're welcome to put your questions in chat or use audio.
Start my video again, sorry.
Aaron, you have a question?
No, I was just I was just thinking. I think I touched the wrong button, but I really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Daniel, do you have a question?
Hi, Kevin. This is Dan Ritchell here. I've followed this project for quite some time along with you, and I've heard versions of it before. And what strikes me here is, I don't know whether you investigated conditions inside the prisons and whether they change as prisoners are moved off of their out of their hometowns into other areas. But is there a correlation between the treatment of prisoners and by wardens who are really coming from an entirely different community, who in fact find themselves running a business or participating in a business rather than being concerned about members of their own community? Is there any such thing that you can discuss?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ritchell. And Dr. Ritchell was the person who supervised the first prison historiography project that I did back in 2018. So thank you for helping out for all these years. Yeah, so I'm going to try to answer that question in two different ways, right? Something that I cut out of this talk just for sake of space is that a big reason why overcrowding becomes such a big debate in the state and a big reason why prison expansion becomes such a big thing is because of a lot of lawsuits over conditions in prisons. So this is the first point about this. Sociologists like Heather Schoenfeld have shown this too. Historians like Robert Chase, if people are interested in this. So people start suing from the inside over conditions, largely in these urban prisons. And the state's response, ironically, is to build these larger prisons further out, right? So that's one part of this. Second part is yes and no. I haven't done enough research to tell like writ large what happens for treatment, right? But there is a lot of evidence that the further afield these things are, the harder they are to see inside, right? There's less oversight in places like this, so there's more of these cases where people discover horrible treatment just because there's no access to lawyers and family members to talk to. So yeah. Hope that answered your question. Thank you.
What is the argument about keeping prisoners closer to their families instead of having them being moved to rural areas far from where their families can easily visit them?
So I think, that's an argument that you see come up over and over again. And like there is something to, people having access to their families is always good, right? That's always a positive thing for people. No matter what you think about the prison system, people being able to see their families is good from a rehabilitative standpoint, just from a basic human standpoint, right? I think that's something we should never lose sight of. I think the big thing for state officials is in addition to these like large scale protests, and these also happen in other places, like Ruth Gilmore talks about how in the 1970s in California and East Los Angeles, there's supposed to be these prison projects, and Latinx mothers actually fight this out of the city, right? So this phenomenon that happens elsewhere, right? The argument from state officials is they can do these things cheaper and with a more desperate labor force further afield. So this isn't really done with people in prison in mind, right? This is done the question of the state being able to easily do these things. I think that answers your question, but if there's another part of it. Thank you.
I had a question. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I don't know, like you would probably know this better than me, but I would imagine that the kind of like trend of this trend of prison siting has probably continued or accelerated in the past 20 years after the period you're talking about. Would that be correct? Or
okay, yes and no, right? I'm trying to think of like broader state examples. So I think the 1980s and 1990s is where you see a lot of this. You also see the federal system builds out in places like Montana and Appalachia during this time. there's been some rural prison closures of late, but I think what complicates this is that the big rise after this period is things like immigration detention centers. It's another kind of prison, right? And those are all rural. So yes. But as far as state systems, the biggest growth in state systems happens in the 1980s and 90s, and that tends to be rural. So there hasn't been a huge growth afterwards just because there hasn't been as many prisons built between the 90s and today as there was between the 70s and the 90s.
And kind of like a follow-up question to that, I was going to say that, like, how do you, because you talked about like agency, like the role of agency, like, do you think that, like you were saying like a lack of kind of creation of like prison sites, like, you know, after that period, do you think that that's like come as a result of, you know, activist work, like, you know, or, you know, I mean, that's one factor, there's many factors, I'm sure. And then also like on top of that, how do you think that the, like in a more recent, you know, like, you know, today, like that the dynamics of like prison siting, like impact, like activists who are trying to like work for any type of like prison reform?
Like the kind of spatial orientation of prisons, how does that affect activism? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it has a big effect. Largely, I mean, you've seen that there's stuff in like the New York Times recently about this because, you know, you have entire rural economies that are based on prisons now, and that is harder to break for activists, right? So like you can think of a place, you know, Maryland's a good example because the difference in politics from Cumberland to Baltimore is, you know, it could be different countries, right? So that's harder. But yeah, sorry, I'm trying to like think of another way to answer your question. But I also think that the larger agency point that I'm trying to make here, and maybe I didn't spell it out clear enough in the talk, is that, you know, this broad expansion of prisons didn't have to continue after the 1970s when people were suggesting alternatives for their neighborhoods, right? People were requesting services, requesting things that would help people in poverty, right? And so I think the agency point that I like to make about mass incarceration is that it's not inevitable, even if we're always going to have crime, that we're always going to need to warehouse so many people, right? And so the state's insistence and, you know, police organizing's insistence that this is the way that it has to be, I think is just sort of a failure for us to see that there's another way, right? As historians and as activists, right?
I have another question if no one is lining up. I've always been fascinated by sort of what sort of impact this would have had on the local community um, in Somerset County or in Garrett County. And if you, I mean, I've spent some part of my life going out on weekends kayaking in Western Maryland, and if you talk to the locals, the impression they leave you with is that they believe that Baltimore is a den of criminality that is just unstoppable, and that and I just wonder whether that attitude to urban criminality, the belief that somehow the cities are particularly nasty places filled with people who are prone to criminality. I know that's historically it's always been there, but does it get any worse in this period as a result of the siting of penal institutions in places like Hagerstown, where I think, you know, stop me if I'm wrong, but the population of the prison must rival the population of, or certainly be a good portion of the population of the local town itself. Do they get a sort of a distorted vision of what is happening in places like Baltimore?
I'm not, you know, I'm not totally sure. This isn't something I've looked into extensively. I would say just off the top of my head that, you know, I think that this is very spatially specific, right? If we look at a place like Princess Anne or Somerset County, Maryland, as I was talking about, you know, there's a big civil rights contingency there that's fighting that Voting Rights Act lawsuit right around the same time. And so I think that there's a different understanding of what mass incarceration means anytime you have a concentration of people fighting like that, understanding the inequality that's baked into it. Hagerstown is interesting because it's always sort of been a prison town, right? It's like that's kind of the bread and butter of a town. And so, and you know, Cumberland to some extent too, in recent years has become that way. And when your bread and butter is locking people up, of course, you're going to want to believe that that crime is the worst thing possible, right? And it's never been worse, right? So I think that would be my answer, although I don't have a ton of empirical data in front of me to support that. Yeah.
More questions? Okay then, well, thank you, Kevin. Thank you everyone for attending the latest lecture in the symposium. Just to give a short little plug, the next symposium lecture will be on Wednesday, October 26th at 12 o'clock. It will be by Ellen McDougall, exploring the Inside Out Baltimore Prison Exchange Program. So hope to see everyone there. And with that, I'm going to stop recording.
Thank you.